Welcome to the Leadership Purpose with Dr. Robin podcast. I'm your host, Robin L. Owens, Ph.D., and this is where we dive in each week to give advice, tools, and tips for high-achieving women who have written books that make a difference for people while at work. I am a professor, and when I'm not doing that, I am speaking, writing, coaching, and teaching high-achieving women who have written books how to make a bigger difference, have more impact, and more purpose with their books. Okay, let's dive in. Before we get started with the episode, I want to ask you a question. Is your book ready to be turned into a successful online course? That's a question so many people have asked me. And so I decided to create a free resource to answer that very question. I took the time-tested process that I use for turning books into successful online courses, and I created a checklist that you can review and check off so you know the ways in which your book can be turned into a successful online course. So just head on over to createmasterfulcourses.com, createmasterfulcourses.com, and get your free checklist there. All right, now let's get to the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Leadership Purpose with Dr. Robin podcast. I'm so glad you're here and you take time to listen into the podcast. I say it all the time, and I will continue to say it. I really, really appreciate you. You have helped the podcast get ranked in the top 5% of all podcasts globally, according to Listen Notes, the podcast search engine. So I really appreciate you for listening in. And if you want to do something else, go over, rate, subscribe, review, and that'll help us keep the podcast going. All right. So now today I'm talking with Mary Hiland, Ph.D. Mary is the author of the book, Love Your Board, the Executive Director's Guide to Discovering the Sources of Nonprofit Board Troubles and What to Do About Them. She brings over 40 years of experience to nonprofit leaders to create a paradigm shift about how to develop an informed and inspired board that is truly an asset. Her mission is to help nonprofits ignite and unleash the potential of the board, getting rid of the mindset that the board is a burden. Her deep expertise and hands-on experience bring credibility and confidence to nonprofit leaders who know she understands because she's been there. Welcome, Mary Hiland.
Oh, thank you so much, Robin. I'm just delighted to be here and so grateful to be invited.
I'm glad you're here and I'm looking forward to our conversation. Okay, so now I just read a general intro bio for you. Why don't you tell us in your own words about who you are and the work you do?
Well, I've had a long career, as you said. I started as an executive director myself, and I did that. I was an executive in nonprofits for 26 years. And then, frankly, I just felt called. I fought it, but I felt called. I was at the peak of my career. I had won some awards. I had a fabulous board. It wasn't that I didn't like my job. My daughter had had a baby and everybody said, oh, okay, you're retiring. No, I'm not retiring. Well, so I just stepped out of the role to discover something new, which was then led me to consulting and coaching executive directors with a focus on their boards and leadership in general. I got a Ph.D. with a focus on governance and leadership for nonprofits. And my coaching business has been very successful. I've been doing it for 20 years now. So I've been around a long time, seen a lot of problems. But I would say, and I'm sure you experienced this too, writing the book, launching my own podcast, there's always something new and a new way to be in how you're serving others. And so in the last couple of years, I've been more focused on helping the executive, the nonprofit leader, recognize that they can be the catalyst for change for their board. They don't need to bring me into the boardroom to do it for them, but I want to empower executive directors to really realize that they can be that catalyst. They can spark that change, even though the board is their boss. And that's a challenge.
Yeah,
So,
I love that. It's such important work because nonprofits are doing the best they can to have impact and make a difference for others, and for you to give their leaders that support and empowering them that way, to me, is a tremendous value to them and what you bring.
well, I love doing it. It's inspiring work.
Okay, I want to back up a little bit. You said you felt called. Say a little more about how that call presented itself. We know it wasn't from the new grandchild. So how?
Well, right. Well, I do have a spiritual practice. I don't consider myself particularly religious, but I like to think that I'm in tune with my intuition, if you will, whatever you want to call it. And I have an executive coach. I've had her for over 20 years. And I just started to feel this, I don't know whether you call it a nudge, a sense of, I'm not sure that I was getting as much out of the job as I could. That could be part of it as I reflect back, that I just felt ready for something new. You know, if you've ever had that feeling like I'm ready for a change. I want something new. It's not that where I am is bad, because it wasn't at all. And so I talked about it with my coach. And it's interesting you ask about this, because I kept pushing back and saying, oh, well, I'm doing great. This is fine. And we had had a conversation before about her pushing me about goals. And she said, I want you to think of yourself as a bleached blonde on a motorcycle. I want you to step out of your comfort zone. And so that is not me. Your listeners can't see me, but I'm a brunette and I'm not a motorcycle person at all. But anyway, I kept pushing back and I said to her, is this another one of these bleach blonde on the motorcycle things you're pushing me? She said, no, I just am pushing you to be honest with yourself. And it took about a year for me to act on it and for me to say, something is pulling me away from this, and I don't know what else is going to come. And if I don't get out of this, I won't be able to discover what maybe I should be doing in this next step, because I was just too busy. As a nonprofit CEO, I'm working 50 hours a week at least. So I just resigned, and I didn't have another job. My husband and I did okay for a while, but it didn't take very long for people started calling me, because I'd been around for 26 years. They knew I'd done 2 mergers. I led 2 mergers in the nonprofit I was running. And so people started to call me, less experienced execs wanting a mentor, basically. I would say not so much a coach, but a mentor, somebody who'd been there and knew what they were going through. And that started it all off, and here I am.
So that then prompted you to then start your own business in this way?
Well, I waited around. So here's another lesson. I waited around because I thought, well, because of my faith, I thought, well, God's just going to show me. I'm just going to trust, and this path is going to open up. And so I actually had joined a small business group before I resigned, and I was going to that once a month. And after listening to me in my ambivalence about all this, after a year, I remember one of them looking at me and saying, would you just get over it and put a stake in the ground, get business cards, call yourself a consultant, and just do it. If something else is going to come along, it'll come along, but just do it. And I did. So, and that was right. That was the right thing to do.
So now, did the people seeking help call you before you had that moment?
Yes.
So they were actually calling you.
Well, they knew me. I've lived in this area forever. I was actually born in the Bay Area in California. And so I was involved a lot in leadership things going on in the nonprofit sector, because after the 2 mergers, we had a large nonprofit. I had 530 staff, and I was out there, in advocating. The agency I ran was a mental health agency. I was passionate about stigma, reducing stigma, and promoting mental health services, which in those days were not. Nowadays, you hear about mental health all the time. COVID was a good thing in that regard. Not in the days when I was running things. There was still a lot of stigma, at least when I started. And so very passionate about that. So it's kind of an enigma for me to think, well, how can I not be passionate about that if I step out of this? But anyway, that's a little off from your question.
No.
Yeah, some colleagues I knew, some others called. Some called when they learned that I was doing these studies around boards. The local, the Center for Excellence in Nonprofits, you may have heard of them because they do broader work since COVID, but they're sort of a management and leadership development support for other nonprofits. They called and the exec said, would you do some workshops about board stuff? So that also helped because I started doing some best practice. I don't like to use that phrase, but best practice workshops.
I love the way life was getting your attention.
Yeah.
One person, one call, no pun intended.
Yeah.
One call at a time, right? They were reaching out to you. I
Yeah.
wanted to hear that story because I think it's inspiring as we pay attention to the way our lives are trying to get us
Right.
get our attention. Yeah.
I really believe in the concept of vocation. And I don't think we talk about it enough. And that calling, whatever that is, and however it shows up in your life. And for people who write books, it makes me think, are you being called to get your voice out there? Yeah.
I love that. I think about that too in terms of vocation. And I'm wondering right now out loud, for those of us who have written books and might be a little hesitant about really promoting and getting themselves out there, if the notion of vocation would empower one to do that. Yeah.
I would hope so, because if you've written a book, you have something to say. I mean, especially a nonfiction book, I think we're talking about, stories have something to say too, of course.
But yeah, you're right. And we're focusing here on people who are primarily women consultants who have written books to make a difference for people in that work. Yeah.
Right.
All right. So this is fascinating. And I see I can ask you 100 questions, but I'm going to try to stay focused here. I already veered off the path, but there really is no path, right? It's just a conversation for us and for those who are listening to us. All right. So we heard about your journey. So now tell us about the book. Tell us the title again, and then tell us the premise of the book.
Well, it's a long title. It's called Love Your Board. I mean, that came to me pretty quickly. That's the outcome I want. I want people to literally love their boards. But let me just say one extra thing about that in two ways. I want you to love your board in the sense that you're excited about the board you have. They're your partner. But I also want you to realize that you have to personally connect with everybody on your board. And in many ways, that's the same thing, is you need to love each person who is serving your nonprofit as a volunteer, and that will inform your effectiveness as a leader with your board. But anyway, the book is called Love Your Board, The Executive Director's Guide to Discovering the Sources of Nonprofit Board Troubles and What to Do About Them. And the book's core is that this is the result of a ton of research I was doing, and I had this huge chart up on my wall, and I went through all of my cases that I'd worked with, because I was looking for what's the voice, what's the message I want to get across. I knew I wanted to write to executive directors, and I knew I wanted to write about boards, but I didn't want to write the board book that's out there in a zillion places. Here's what you should do as a board member. To me, that there's enough of that. And what I realized is that I looked at all the presenting problems executives had brought to me and the ones that were related to their boards. And I found that they all fell into three, I'll call here buckets, but in the book I call them dimensions. There's three dimensions of your board. And then I started to look at new problems coming in to really test this idea. Is it really true that I can put every issue that comes up with your board in one of these three buckets? And I can, and you can. And they are capacity, connection, and culture. And capacities, And each of those has a people and a process dimension. So I don't want to get too complicated about it. But if you think about the metaphor I use in the book, which I love, I have a big oak tree in my backyard. And so the leaves on the tree are the capacity dimension of your board. This is the people you have, the kind of people. Do you have the right people? Do you have enough people? Are they giving you enough time? And also your processes. Do you have effective board meetings? Do you have good board policies? I mean, this is the stuff that's fairly easy to fix and is, dare I say, a little more on the surface, but very, very important. You can't have an effective board without those things. But all those leaves, all those things are connected through connection, which is another word for relationships. And so when you think of the tree, the branches going down to create the trunk are all about the relationships. Now, this is about inside your nonprofit. This is about your board. It's not about your relationships with the external community in terms of the way I write about it. The trunk is actually the board as a team, all these relationships coming together. So that's the connection dimension. And then, of course, you have all the roots that are hidden sometimes, like culture in our organizations, cultures in our group, cultures in our individuals. Culture is everywhere, but it's often hidden. But it is the foundation of everything. And so the board has a culture, whether they acknowledge it or not, and the culture drives everything else that happens, the health of the tree. So I love that metaphor. And each goes a little deeper. You know, you have capacity, and then the connections are a little harder to deal with because it's people, right? And then the culture is about your assumptions, your beliefs, the way you act reveals your culture, your assumptions, and your beliefs, whether you're aware of it or not. So anyway, that if you want to change something at the cultural level of the board, it takes more work. It's harder. And there's a process. A colleague I have wrote a beautiful book called Group Alchemy, and her name's Dr. Deborah Pruitt. And she talks about culture and groups in that book. And that's the only book I drew on with her permission in my book, because she has such a great process. She had such great ideas about how to work on that. So anyway.
Yeah, it sounds like a very thorough and effective process because it's divided into those three dimensions. And I'm guessing that it could also apply to other groups, not just boards. I know that's your expertise.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's a great thought. I hadn't thought of it that way, but it could. And I think that the idea here was that people were calling me over the years, over and over again, and they still do once in a while, and say, would you just come train my board and in their job, in their roles and responsibilities? And of course you can do that, but training doesn't change behavior. And so the key here was I was discovering over and over again that while I would training gives you knowledge, training can give you awareness of something, but I was seeing over and over again that the real issue that the executive director was facing and dealing with wasn't going to be solved by training, maybe nudged, but not solved. And so the book is intended for people to look deeper and really be sure that the problem they're trying to solve is the right problem.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I could imagine people who have other consultants who may have teams that they work with that use these same principles and the same ideas to work with them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's true. You know, you have capacity in your group, you know, the people, their skills, their talents, the processes you agree on together that you're going to use to get your work done. But then you also have relationship, and you're not really a strong team if you don't have strong relationships. And then, of course, you have the culture of the team.
Yes, I could see that very clearly. Okay, so now let's talk about your author hat, right? We were talking about your consultant role.
Yeah.
Okay, so now let's shift over to your author hat. And keep in mind, this is for we're hopefully inspiring people who are also wearing their author hat right now.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
So as you are getting this book into the hands of others, what has been your greatest joy?
That it's helpful, that people say, oh my God, I wish I had this book when I started being an executive director, and board members saying, oh my gosh, this book is so helpful to us. So that validation, you want your book to help in some way. So getting some validation that it really has been the biggest joy of having the book.
I love that. It makes it all worth it, I would imagine.
It does.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's a lot, as you all know out there.
It is. All right. So on the other side of that, what has been one of the challenges of getting your book into the right hands and hearts and minds of people? And how did you manage that?
Well, I actually did hire someone to help me a little with marketing during the launch. I didn't spend a lot of money, but she helped me with social media. She read the book, she pulled out snippets and created a plan for me that was over a couple of months, 2 or 3 months, of what we needed to do to get out there, to get the word out. And that was very helpful. I haven't done a lot of marketing of the book. I do mention it. It's in my podcast notes every time I tell people about it, because in my consulting work, what I found is that I know there's tools and tips and solutions in that book that are going to be helpful to people that are reaching out to me. So, but I'm thinking I need to do, it's been 2.5 years now. So I'm thinking I need to do a more purposeful, a little bit new marketing and, relaunch to get a little more out there. But, money trickles in very small every month. So I know people are still getting it in spite of me, So, but it's not about the money, but it's a little validation that people still buy it.
Yeah, and it's an indicator, the movement is happening when you see
that
when
it's
you see the
still
royalties
there.
coming in. Yeah, yeah.
Right.
All right, so now let's talk to the author who's listening, who is a high achieving woman who is good at a few things. So people come to her and ask her questions professionally and personally, just because she's doing all the things, right? And then on top of it, she's written this book. So she's often giving support, but does not receive a lot of support.
Oh, well, yeah.
Sounds like a tone of recognition there.
Oh, yes. Well, I have to say, if I didn't have I have 3 coaches. And while I'm not a certified coach or anything, and none of these coaches are certified, although the first one that I've had for so many years, she was an executive director who retired right about the time when, after our biggest merger, I was selected to be the CEO of the nonprofit when our nonprofit moved into another one. And she approached me and said, I'm kicking off my coaching. Would you like to try it? And I've been calling her every week for 22 years. And I would say that having somebody, however you put that together, you get a mentor, doesn't have to be a paid coach, but having somebody who has your best interests at heart. But in my case, someone who had been in the role, who had been an executive, understands nonprofits. That was important to me to talk to give you perspective. If you're a sole proprietor, I'm just me in my office, so that makes such a difference to have that. And then I will say, when I was writing the book, I had another colleague who had written a lot of books, but she was in the fundraising space. And I asked her, she offered, and I asked her to read the book as I went along, because she had also been an executive director. And what really helped me was having someone who had perspective about my audience. If I asked some of my client executives to read it, but they love me, they're not going to give me the same straight shooting feedback that she did. And that was extremely valuable, because you don't see your book and what you're writing in the same way somebody else sees it. So having that support while I was writing, having my coach mentor were just really important to me,
Yeah.
to know that there were people who cared about me, but would tell me the truth, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. And what a gift to have that
Yeah.
mentor for 22 years. That's
Wow.
a huge gift because of the
Yeah.
consistency. You can learn and grow if you're talking to someone long term and maybe track patterns and help guide in a certain way.
Yeah.
You've got
Yeah.
that kind of history. So what a true gift.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's always been on the phone because she moved out of the area. So those of you out there, it doesn't have to be in person. It doesn't have to be a lot of time, but that person who's really can hear you,
Yeah,
very valuable.
that's wonderful.
Yeah.
All right. So now the podcast is Leadership Purpose.
Yes.
And so, in your opinion, and we kind of were in the neighborhood when we were talking about vocation, but do you think it's important to have purpose in your work or for others to have a sense of purpose in their work? And if so, why? If not, why not?
I think it's critical. I think that, and I would say we have it, whether we acknowledge it or not, Robin, because we all have a why. Why do we do the things we do? And why do we choose to spend our time in certain things? I mean, Peter Senge, who wrote a lot about management and leadership, made a comment to an executive director who it was a group thing. And she was saying, well, it's so hard for me to make time for my own professional development because I'm too busy as an executive director, which a lot of nonprofits say that a lot. And he said, you make time for what you value. And so I think it's important for us individually to do some of that self-review and figure out, why do we do this? I think there's a book out there that has some advice, the 5 whys. Ask yourself why, and then ask yourself, once you answer it, ask yourself why about that. And I think all this helps us discover what our purpose is, which is in many ways the same thing as our values, whether it's to learn, whether it's to give back, whether it's to make money, for heaven's sakes. There's nothing wrong with that. Have
Right.
some security. One of my values, which at first I thought, well, this sounds really self-serving, but the more I thought about it and read about it, is to be significant. Now, to be significant to me means to make a difference,
Mhm,
that somebody notices.
mhm.
If I'm not significant, I'm not helping. I'm just, keeping my light under my bushel kind of thing. So
Yeah. Yeah.
anyway, I hopefully that answers the
Yes,
question.
yes, you answered the question, and I can relate to them making a difference. I started my professional career after my first 5 years. I went on a quest to make a difference in other people's lives. I left that leadership role to do that, and I found it and have done that. So I can relate to what you were saying. All right, you've been so generous with your time, Mary. Is there anything else that you want to say that maybe I didn't get a chance to ask you, or a thought that comes to mind now?
No, I just, if people want to connect with me or reach out, or they can listen to my podcast too, Inspired Nonprofit Leadership. But Hiland is spelled Hiland, and my website's highlandconsulting.org, O-R-G. So just reach out if you have more questions or if I can be of service to you.
Okay, and we'll be sure to put that in the show notes so people could reach out to you.
Thank you.
Mary, this has been such a delight. Thank you for being here and sharing your time, your expertise, your wisdom, and your heart.
Oh, thank you, Robin. It's such a pleasure. And I so appreciate you inviting me to have this conversation and reflect on some of these things. It's been great.
I'm glad. Okay, everyone. And, I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the podcast on this episode. I'm on all social media, but I hang out most in LinkedIn. So if you head on over to the message in LinkedIn and just let me know your response to the podcast at Robin L. Owens, PhD, at Robin L. Owens, PhD at LinkedIn. And if you are an author, like we've been talking about, and you're a consultant and your book really, you wrote your book because you really want to make a difference and have impact. And now you're thinking about how to broaden your message, get it out there beyond the book. And you've been thinking about creating a course, but you don't know if your book really is ready for a course. Can it even be transformed into a course? If you're asking that question, I created a free resource just for you. And it's a checklist. You could just go over the checklist and it'll tell you all the ways in which your book can be turned into a successful course. And that is at my website, createmasterfulcourses.com, createmasterfulcourses.com, and you can get your free checklist there. And in the meantime, this is Dr. Robin. Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Leadership Purpose with Dr. Robin podcast. If you enjoyed it, head on over and rate and subscribe so you never miss an episode. New episodes drop every week, and I can't wait to hang out with you again soon. Meanwhile, this is Dr. Robin signing off. See you next time.